The instructor and the student tend to forget that they've got a 90-day clock ticking. There's like 8 or 9 endorsements that I have to look at and check every single one of them off. If one of them is missing, the ride isn't going to happen unless the instructor is there to fix it.
Recently, we had an extended discussion about epic check ride fails, things that applicants do or don't do that virtually guarantee this check ride is not going to work out the way you want. But Pat, there are, on the flip side, things that an applicant can do that can dramatically increase their chances of being successful and in the process, probably lower their stress level. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. It is all in the hands of the applicant, no question.
So we could call these best practices, things. I'll come up with a better title with that. But if you're preparing for a check ride, any check ride where you're going to be flying with an examiner, designated pilot examiner, there are best practices that it's worth knowing. And number one for me, Pat, in all honesty, brief with your CFI. Make time to sit down at a table, not in the airplane, with your logbook and your 8710. Make sure everything's filled out correctly. Grab a calculator. Make sure you have the sufficient number of hours for cross country, for solo, for night, for hood time. All of it worked out. Make sure all the endorsements your CFI was supposed to put in your logbook are in your logbook, because it is really demoralizing when you go to a check ride. And I know people have had this happen where
Yep.
they're 1/10 short, 6 minutes short on a requirement, or
Yep.
an endorsement is missing, or they didn't check something on the 8710, and for whatever reason, it becomes a problem. That's a pretty simple thing to fix, don't you think?
Yeah, talking about endorsements, for example, we can use the private pilot check ride as an example, but the illustration is across really all check rides. There is an advisory circular out there. The CFIs will know or should know. It's 61-65H hotel, 61-65H, and that lists all of the endorsements that are required for all the check rides that you're likely to take over your career. It's there's no end to the number of endorsements for a private pilot check ride. And this is just off the top of my head, but we need the pre-solo test endorsement. We need the initial solo endorsement once you're allowed to go solo. We need the 90-day extensions if you go beyond 90 days. You need an endorsement for cross countries. You need an endorsement to be able to take the knowledge test. There's 5 right there. Then you need to have the endorsement that says that that you've received the ground and aeronautical training required, and you're qualified to take the written test. And I think that quotes 107, 61, 107, and 109. Then there's the one that talks about your 3 hours of check ride prep within the 2 calendar months preceding the month of the check ride, and the other one that says that you've got whatever deficiencies in the knowledge test have been gone over between you and the instructor. So there's like 8 or 9 endorsements that I have to look at and check every single one of them off. If one of them is missing, the ride isn't going to happen unless the instructor is there to fix it. And here's something that happens with, I would say, frustrating frequency, and that is after the initial 90-day and maybe after the subsequent 90-day extension, the instructor and the student tend to forget that they've got a 90-day clock ticking. And I have a number of times I've gone in and I've seen the student has X number of hours of solo time, but it happened after the 90-day endorsement had expired. Folks, I hate to tell you, but technically that time didn't happen, and it can't be counted towards the check ride.
Yeah, and that's one of the great values of 6165 Hotel as well that I really like. All those endorsements have a specific wording that the FAA wants to see. Your
Right.
CFI shouldn't just be making up their own wording. And this goes to both the applicant, the student, and the CFI. You can check each other. The applicant can use that advisory circular as well to look through their book and see, is that endorsement the way the FAA wants to see it? And if it's not, let's fix that before I go to see the examiner. Because as you say, all those little details may seem picayune, but this is a highly regulated industry. And the test requirements are requirements, not suggestions. You have to have it this way.
Yeah, some logbooks, well, in fact, most logbooks have pages in the back with pre-printed endorsements.
Mhm.
That's wonderful. But some of the older logbooks talk about the 3 hours of check ride prep within the preceding 60 days. That's different than the preceding 2 calendar months from the month you're doing the check ride. So, for example, if you're doing a check ride here in May, that means March and April are the 2 calendar months preceding this month. So you really could go really 3 months from the last check ride prep flight. If your check ride was at the end of May, you could conceivably go without flying with a flight instructor for almost a month before you would be outside that 60-day two previous calendar months thing. Not saying it's smart, but that's the reality. So if an instructor is not there to come in, let's see if we can figure out a way to fix this. The check ride's over before it starts. One of the things that I ask applicants to bring with them is a copy of the IACRA application. It's FAA Form 8710, but a copy of the IACRA application that their instructor has signed with the electronic signature. Not with doesn't have to be with a handwritten signature, with the electronic signature. The FAA accepts that as a legitimate signature. And here's the reason why. Most check rides happen quite satisfactorily with IACRA. You can say what you want about, how usable the program is, but the fact of the matter is that most of the time using IACRA is a fairly seamless experience if you've had some experience with the program. But it isn't 100% fail-safe. Notably, about 6 or 8 months ago, there was a national outage of IACRA for almost a week, which meant that everything that we did had to be done on paper.
I remember that. It was a real pain in the
Oh,
butt.
what a pain in the neck. It's really funny, too, because 30 years ago when IACRA was first introduced, and I was not an examiner at that time, but I can remember examiners railing against, why do we have to do this? Paper is perfectly good. And now, all these years later, it's made a 180-degree turn, and people say, why are we going to do paper? IACRA makes it so much easier, which is true when it
I did
works.
an 8710 form on paper maybe a dozen years ago, just
Yeah,
because you still could get it done that way. I was doing a CFI renewal,
yeah.
and I took it into the Orlando FSDO office to get it processed. And I did this because I was going to write an article about how the process works. So you have to actually go through it. And the poor guy I handed it to, his face fell. He's like, "Why are you doing this to me? I got to go type all this in now." I felt
Yeah.
so bad for him.
Yeah. Well,
But
there's some truth there, but the reason that I asked for the printed copy of the 8710 with the instructor's electronic signature on page 2 is that if IACRA goes down, the check ride is over
Mhm.
unless we have a paper copy. Now, we could download off of the FAA website, which is not IACRA. We could download an 8710 and fill it out right there, and the applicant can sign it and whatnot. But if the instructor is not there to sign it, then once again, we're dead in the water. So having an IACRA application, an 8710 form, that's been completed, signed by the instructor, and printed out, and in your folder, hopefully you have a folder or a binder with you. That's kind of like the belt and suspenders. You can wear a belt, but if you really want to make sure your pants don't fall down, you wear suspenders too. That's your belt and suspenders to make sure that the check ride goes smoothly.
This is a little outside the box, I suppose, but it might be worth talking to your CFI, depending on where they work and how things work. Just say, can you be available for the first half hour of my check ride? Just in case there's a paperwork issue, can you be in the building? You probably have to pay for that, but it would lower your stress level.
Most of the time, not 100% of the time, but most of the time, where I do check rides in multiple schools around the area, The instructor is there for the first 10 or 15 minutes to make sure that all the endorsements are properly done and anything else that may come up that he or she can fix. The other thing, another thing that I need to see is and none of this is a mystery. This is all on the checklist inside the ACS. I need to see a copy of the knowledge test. It has to be an original copy of the knowledge test, not a photocopy. That used to be easier to tell when they had the embossed seal on the old knowledge tests. Now, basically, the testing centers simply just print out a copy and it's got your FTN number on it, and they send you off with it. So that's harder to tell whether it's original or not, but I haven't run into any issues with that. And you obviously got to be able to speak English and so on and so forth. So the endorsements, the signed 8710, the original knowledge test, and then we got to identify you and make sure you is who you say you is. And so that means a driver's license or passport, not a copy of your driver's license or a copy of your passport. It has to be the original.
That's a weird thing. It's a generational thing, but I noticed my kids' generation, people have a picture of their license on their phone, but don't carry the actual license, which might be okay in a traffic stop, but there's a lot of places it's not.
It's not okay with the FAA. In fact, 61, I think it's 61.3 that talks about documentation. It says something about having to have the actual document on your person. I don't remember the exact wording, but it's very clear that it's not or a photocopy or a facsimile thereof. It's the original document. So your driver's license or a passport or a government issued photo ID, the original. Same thing with your pilot certificate. It cannot be a photocopy of your pilot certificate, even if it's a nice color photocopy that's been laminated or no, cannot be that. It's got to be the original. Same thing with a medical. And if you opt to laminate the medical, it's perfectly okay to do, but you got to sign it first. Several months ago, I had a guy show up. This is a high-powered executive, big money guy, and he pulled out his medical, and he puts it down in front of me, and he had not signed it, and it was laminated. And he said, "Well, can I just sign it with a Sharpie?" Sorry, it's got to be signed on the original, not my rules.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so that delayed the check ride for quite some time because he had to go get another medical because the fact that he had not taken the time to sign it. Oh, and by the way, the back of your pilot certificate, your student pilot certificate, or private instrument or commercial, whatever you have, the back side of that, sign that too. If it's not signed, it's not a valid certificate. And you'd be surprised at the number of people that put their certificate in front of me and I look on the back and it's not signed, not
Mm-hmm.
valid. It's got to be signed. So these are things that are really, really easy to do. And this is just in terms of just having your identification and endorsements and things. And then we get to what you were talking about earlier, Jamie, the logbook. Tab the logbook. We have to look and make sure, number one, that you have, let's talk about private pilot, that you've got at least 40 hours, that you've got at least 20 hours of dual, that you've got at least 10 hours of PIC, that you've got at least 5 hours of cross country, 3 hours of cross country dual, your 3 hours of night, including your long cross country and your takeoffs and landings at a towered field, or excuse me, in a traffic pattern, your 3 hours of check ride prep. All of those things we have to look at and check off one by one. You have this, you have this, you have this. So some people will take their logbook and they'll put it into a spreadsheet with the appropriate dates and what the time is. And so it's very easy to say, well, there's the long cross country. Let's go back to the logbook and we'll look it up. Other people just have their logbooks, and that's fine. If you're using an electronic logbook like ForeFlight or Garmin Pilot or one of those apps, Pilot Partner, there's a number of electronic apps out there. It's perfectly okay. But again, you've got to make sure that things are logged properly. I've had some instances where in one particular app that's an electronic logbook, it said in the summary that the applicant had the appropriate number of whatever it was we were looking at, or hours, I don't remember what. And I said, okay, well, let's take a look at the actual logbook entry. And there was a discrepancy between the two. And this is on an electronic logbook where theoretically that stuff's not supposed to happen. But it did, and it caused some problems. We were able to resolve the problem, but it did cause some problems. So making sure that that logbook, whether it's electronic or whether it's paper or pixels, making sure that that's properly tabbed or marked in some way. Same thing with the endorsements. If it's an electronic endorsement, you've got to make sure especially if your instructor's not there, you've got to make sure that you know how to access those endorsements. I had a situation the other day where the kid was using paper and an electronic flight log,
Oh,
and the endorsements were all in the electronic flight log, not in his paper book. And he'd never accessed those endorsements by himself without the instructor being in the room, and the instructor wasn't there. So we almost had to call the check ride because he couldn't produce the endorsements that I was sure were there, but because he couldn't produce them so that I could see them, that almost cost the check ride until he was able to get in touch with his instructor who walked him through how to do it. So if you're going to use electronic stuff, you better know how to use the electronic stuff because I've got to ask to see that.
all that stuff is absolutely critical, as you say, by regulation. You've got to have it. But when I learned to fly, as you know, Pat, it was 100 years ago or so, I had a flight bag. And every flight I went on, I had that flight bag. And inside that was pens and pencils and flashlights and charts and plotters and an E6B. I had my headset in there, my foggles or my hood, a copy of, back then it was the PTS, now the ACS. But the reason I got in the habit of flying with that all the time is when I went to the check ride, it felt like a normal day to me. But I have everything I need in this one bag. A lot of people have gone to the electronic flight bag. And as you say, you can have your logbook on there and you have ForeFlight and all kinds of great gadgetry. I'm old school. I still fly with a flight bag. It's not as big as it used to be, but it has everything I need in it. And that is a challenge at flight checks. Sometimes people show up and they don't have the foggles. They don't have a chart or an iPad. They don't have a whiz wheel or whatever they need. And all of a sudden they can't do things that they're required to do.
Yeah, and we talked about that on a previous episode about an applicant that showed up without the foggles. That's happened 3 or 4 times, and well over 1,000 check rides that I've done just in the last 5 years. Um, uh,
That is a staggering number. Let me just say, that's staggering to me that you've done 1,000 check rides. I've done, I don't know, a dozen or two, and I was the applicant.
Well, I haven't done 1,000 as the applicant, but nonetheless, but it happens occasionally, and normally it's an inconvenience, but it's not a big deal. And a part of that depends on the attitude of the applicant when we discover that we don't have the foggles. If they want to be argumentative about it, the outcome may not be pleasant. If they're oh my gosh, I can't believe I forgot that. Can we go back and get them? 99 and a half times out of 100 the answer is yep, let's go back. And I'm just I'm just telling myself, calm down, they're nervous, just relax, this is the end of the world, it's going to take 15 or 20 minutes longer, not a big deal, let's make this a success.
I have to say, personal story. I had a commercial check ride once and I had foggles, but the examiner didn't like foggles. He wanted a hood and I didn't have a hood. I had foggles. So I wore the foggles, but he took the charts and put them across the windshield.
Oh, nice, that was safe. That was safe.
Yeah,
So
no collision avoidance anymore, but he can't see outside.
yeah, well, fortunately, you don't have to worry about that on a commercial check ride anymore. That's basically private and instrument.
Mhm.
But again, point well taken. I guess you could come across an examiner that had that kind of a bias, but as far as I'm concerned, if it's a legitimate view limiting device, that's fine. But let's talk about the airplane for a minute because I also have to make sure that the airplane is airworthy. And I'm not a mechanic. You are. You could probably look at it much better than I could. But I have to look at, first of all, we make sure the aero documents are on board and we all can recite those by memory, airworthiness, registration, a radio certificate if you're flying outside the United States, owner's manual or POH, flight operations manual, what have you, and the weight and balance. So we got to make sure that those things are on board. And I'm okay with seeing a photocopy of the airworthiness and the registration, but I'll verify the originals from the airplane when I get out there. But I understand the reluctance to take those things out of the airplane. Photocopies are fine.
Mhm.
I need to see an AD compliance list, and simply having a logbook entry that says ADs checked through whatever the date is and complied with in accordance with whatever. That ain't it. It needs to be an actual AD compliance list, a list of all the ADs on that airplane and the ones that pertain to that particular airplane we're flying, initialed and signed off, and so on and so forth. And there's two in particular, excuse me, there's two in particular that anybody who's listening to this might want to pay attention to. And that is a number of the PA 28 airframes, Warriors and Archers, um, have a wing spar eddy current test, which is a recurring AD. And the reason for that was several years ago in your neck of the woods, Jamie, an arrow lost a wing on takeoff and killed the examiner and the applicant.
Yep.
And not long after that, the FAA determined that there was issues with cracking on the spar in an area that you can't see when you take off all the inspection plates. So this eddy current test was mandated for certain PA-28s, particularly those that were used in flight training. And it's a complicated formula with factored hours and things like that. But I look for that absolutely. And on some of the older Cessna 172s, not the ones that they started making in the 80s after the federal laws on tort reform or whatever changed, but back in the 70s and prior, there's a recurring AD every 100 hours or every next due inspection for the seat rails.
Mhm.
And so on
And
a
that's
flight
no
train,
joke. That's a
no,
real
that is
thing.
no joke. On a training airplane, um, that's every 100 hours. On a non-training airplane, it's at every annual or other inspection. So the thing about 100 hours and annuals and things like that, when it comes to a training airplane, we can overfly 100 hour on a check ride. I'm not saying I don't like to do it. Legally, we can, because first of all, I'm not a flight instructor. They're not paying me to teach them. And so it's not a training flight, i.e., 100 hour isn't required. But I can't overfly an AD that's required at 100 hours. Cannot do that. So if you've got an airplane at 99 and a half hours and we're going to have an hour and a half check ride and the AD on the seat rail hasn't been done, we're not going anywhere. So those two in particular on the most common training airplanes, if anybody's listening to this that's about to take a check ride on a 172 or a PA-28, and it's not all PA-28. Some of the older ones, the 160s and the 180s, are Hershey bar wings. I don't think those are included. But again, that's something that your flight school and your mechanic should be aware of. But make sure that you know about the recurring ADs and you can point those things out to me, because I'm going to expect that you're able to do that. And then, of course, we got to look at the annual, and we got to, the logbook entries for the annual, the 100 hour, the ELT, the transponder altimeter, the VOR check, which doesn't have to be in the logbooks, but it's got to be somewhere if we're going to be using the VOR for navigation. And something people forget about is the compass card.
I was about to mention that.
Yep, the compass card's got to be in there. So what happens sometimes, and most of the flight schools that I deal with, they are pretty good about this. But going over, you talk about sitting down with the CFI before you sit down with me. Sit down with the maintenance records and make absolutely sure that you can go right to the annual, that you can go right to the 100 hour, that you can go right to the ELT, which is oftentimes included with the annual and or the 100 hour, that you can go right to the pedostatic altimeter, transponder, all of that kind of stuff, and you know where that stuff is. It's very frustrating for me to sit there and watch an applicant thumbing through, and I see, because I typically know what these pedostatic check forms look like, right? and they're
Yep.
thumbing through looking for something, and I spot the pedostatic, but I can't say anything. So I'm watching them, thumb back and forth looking for the pedostatic check or what have you, or the annual. And well, there's I can see it says annual, and because they've never seen it before, or it's
Yep.
been so long they don't remember.
Well, and this is one of those things. I think this message is for CFIs as much as applicants.
Of
We have
course,
to keep in mind they're paying us to prepare them. This is our responsibility to walk them through all this and even point out, see, this is the annual inspection endorsement. See what it looks like? And as you say, put a paper clip on the page or tab it in some way. Let them know that there are various logbooks. This is the AD compliance sheet. Even if you have to go introduce them to somebody from the maintenance department and walk them through, because all these things are required on a check ride. And if you walk into that check ride knowing that you've covered all this material in advance and your logbooks are tabbed and all your endorsements are correct and all your hours meet the requirements, your stress level is lower. You're still going to be nervous, but you go in with a much more confident approach than you would if you're walking in that door going, oh man, I hope everything's okay. Because sometimes it's not.
and what that means is that your first encounter with the examiner is going to be much more pleasant, and you're going to spend a few minutes getting acquainted. All of us will spend a few minutes saying things like, tell me a little bit about yourself, or how did you get interested in flying? Do you have brothers and sisters, or what do your parents do, or some meaningless in quotation marks, but it's very meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, uh, Small talk at the beginning, just to, first of all, to kind of prove that we don't have horns and a tail that some people think we do. But I genuinely, and I think every examiner or most examiners, I guess I should say, I think feel the same way. They really want to get to know the person that they're going to be sitting across the table from for the next 2 or 2.5 hours. And I say 2.5 hours because there's going to take some time to do all this paperwork.
Mm-hmm.
But for the next hour and a half or two on an oral, you want to know the person that you're sitting across and get some sort of a human connection going, because that will make them um, relax over time. And typically what I've found is that whereas they may start off really, really, really nervous, once we kind of get into it, there's kind of a rhythm and there's kind of a back and forth, and they realize that it's not, two guys in black suits with a bright light shining in their face. That it really is more of a conversation, and we're not looking for reasons to fail them. We're really not. We just want to make sure that they have an adequate level of knowledge, for whatever it is, certificate or rating or what have you, that they're testing for.
It's absolutely true though that the scuttlebutt amongst students is that the DPE is just the meanest person in the world, and they're the guy I took my private check ride from, my first check ride, his name was Tommy Savage, and his reputation was that he was savage. There were rumors that he had hit people with a clipboard in the cockpit. He was mean as could be. He might punch you. He was the nicest, fairest man. I had a great check ride with him. I absolutely loved it. I came away just elated. But that's the thing. You go to that check ride, and even if you get to your commercial single, the odds are that's only your third check ride. You don't have
Right,
a lot of experience with
right,
this.
right.
And if I had had the opportunity as a younger man to sit down with a wise gentleman such as yourself, Pat, and demystify this process and find out it's not really this big nasty thing. It's just very regimented, it's very regulated. There's things we need to see, and as long as you say, there's that checklist in the ACS. If I can go through that before my check ride and I know I've got all this in place and I've reviewed it with my CFI, the odds of me having a good outcome to my check ride go way up. My stress level
Yeah,
goes way down, and I
yeah,
might actually enjoy myself. So all of
yeah.
this is really good information so that both applicants and CFIs know this is not a roll of the dice when you go to see a DPE. It's a very organized, laid out program, and you just have to be prepared for it like you were anything else.
If you're prepared for it, particularly for the ground portion, if you're really prepared for that, um, and realizing that it's not going to be 100% let's say, rote memorization, kind of like the FAA written test. It's not that like that at all. It's going to be a um, scenario driven event where you're going to have a flight that you're taking, and things are going to happen along the flight that are going to test your knowledge, test the level of your knowledge, and see if you've gotten to the correlation level, or at least the application level, of the knowledge hierarchy. And it's not just you know what is this? That's a pencil. It's a little bit more than that. And your instructor do a mock oral. Better yet, have another instructor that you've never flown with before and maybe don't know all that well do a mock oral for you. They'll find out the weaknesses if you have a stranger that and it will kind of simulate sitting across the table from somebody you don't know.
And I'm going to offer one piece of advice for applicants. You go in with the DPE, you have all this stuff prepared, everything's good. You sail through the oral, you come out of that confidently, and there's a fire that's got smoke blowing across the runway, or the wind is 25, gusted to 35, or something has changed while you're in that, or you just don't feel good. You've been stressed, you didn't sleep well last night, whatever. You can turn to the DPE and say, I'm sorry, but I'd like to ask for a discontinuance on this. I'm not feeling well, or I don't like these conditions, or I found excessive water in the fuel, whatever it is. They're not going to look down on you, but it's better than going and getting in that airplane and putting yourself in a position that's really tough to handle, if at all possible, just because you had the time booked.
Yeah, discontinuances are probably the worst kept secret, or best kept, I guess, depending on which way you want to look at it. But when I do a briefing, I let the applicant know, and we are mandated to tell the applicants how the test can end, with a temporary certificate, with a disapproval, or with a discontinuance. And either one of us can call a discontinuance. So, and that's actually the reason we're able to do this today at the time we're doing it, because I had a discontinuance with a gentleman for an instrument check ride, and the visibility was just below his personal minimum. So he called the check ride. Good for him. He made the right decision.
I love this, Pat. And part of the reason I love this, I've just realized this is the longest video we've ever made, which fits right in with check ride stress. Where people are afraid it's going to be hours and hours of brutality. But
No.
there's been great information here. And seriously, we've talked about this before. You're allowed to talk to your DPE in advance and find out, what do you want to see. Don't treat the designated pilot examiner like the enemy. They're just a person there to evaluate you, and it's only going to be things you've already covered with your CFI. So use that CFI as a resource as you're preparing. Talk to the DPE in advance. And if for some reason things don't go your way on that day, it doesn't mean you suck. It means you had a bad day. Review that with your CFI, come back, take another whack, and you'll probably be successful.
Yep. I totally agree with you, Jamie.
I love it when you agree with me. It just boosts my ego. And as you know, I'm very fragile. I'm a delicate flower. Hey, folks, click like on this, share the video with your friends, because check ride etiquette and how to prepare for one might be one of the biggest mysteries of flight training.
Yeah.
And of course, subscribe to the channel, because we just like that. We're collecting subscriptions. I don't know what we're going to do with them, but we are. Until next time, we'll see you right back here. Fly safe. Enjoy that check ride experience. And maybe if you're really lucky, you get to go with Pat Brown.
Adios, Jamie.
Take care, bud.